In November 1971, a quiet man in a business suit boarded a short flight from Portland to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. Once the plane was airborne, he handed a flight attendant a note and calmly said he had a bomb, he wanted $200,000 and parachutes, and he wanted everyone to stay calm. After the money was delivered and the passengers were released, he ordered the plane back into the night. Then somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, he lowered the rear stairs and jumped. No body was found, no parachute was recovered, and only a small portion of the ransom money ever resurfaced. Tonight, we're uncovering the D.B. Cooper skyjacking, the jump into darkness, and why more than 50 years later this case still has no landing. Cooper didn't rush when he handed over the note. He waited like he already knew the plane would keep climbing and no one could simply step off and walk away from him. And when the flight attendant finally looked down and read it, the message was plain. He had a bomb, and he expected to be taken seriously. When she tried to pocket the note and move on, he leaned closer and asked her to sit. And in a calm voice, he told her to look inside his briefcase. And when she did, she saw what looked like a row of red sticks wired together with a battery and switches, enough to convince anyone in that moment that this wasn't bluffing. He didn't threaten to hurt anyone if they screamed or ran. He didn't need to, because he had already done the most effective thing a hijacker can do. He turned a crowded plane into a quiet room where everyone starts obeying without being asked twice. His demands came out like a checklist: $200,000 in cash, in small bills, and 4 parachutes, and he wanted them waiting when the plane landed in Seattle. He wasn't bargaining, he was instructing. On the ground, the airline and law enforcement treated it like a real bomb situation. The plane was kept away from the terminal, communications went back and forth, and time stretched because Cooper wasn't in a hurry, and the longer it took, the more it proved he believed he could control the ending. While everyone else worked, Cooper stayed steady. He drank his bourbon, he smoked cigarettes, and he spoke politely, which is one of the most unsettling details because panic would have made him easier to understand, but calm makes him feel practiced. When the money finally arrived, bundled and prepared, and the parachutes were delivered, Cooper allowed the passengers to leave one by one, and that decision is the moment the story turns into legend, because he didn't want hostages, he wanted space. With the passengers gone, the cabin became quiet, and now there were only a few people left to witness what happened next: the flight crew, and one flight attendant. He wanted to stay close enough to follow instructions. This is where Cooper starts to look less like a desperate man and more like someone who chose this aircraft for a reason, because the Boeing 727 had a feature most passenger planes didn't: a rear air stair that could be lowered in flight, like a door opening straight into the night. He gave the pilots a set of flight conditions that were strangely specific: low altitude, slower speed, landing gear down, and flap settings that kept the plane stable but also limited range. It was a configuration that suggested he understood what the aircraft could handle with the rear stairs deployed. The crew argued for safety. They pushed back where they could, but Cooper stayed firm. He didn't need to win an argument. He just needed them to take off and fly south long enough for him to disappear. Once the plane lifted off again, he told the crew to stay in the cockpit. He wanted the curtain closed. He wanted no one watching the cabin. And that detail is important because it tells you he didn't want witnesses to the jump. He wanted only sensations, only a shift in the airframe, only the story of what the crew felt, not what they saw. The flight into the night was cold and rough, rain and cloud cover over the Pacific Northwest, wind pushing against the aircraft, and below them, forests, rivers, and open stretches of dark land where a falling person could vanish without leaving a clear mark. Behind the cockpit door, Cooper moved around unseen, tying the money to himself, preparing the parachute, and working with the rear stairs. And even though no one saw him do it, the crew would later describe feeling the aircraft respond, like the back end had changed shape. At some point, a warning light suggested the rear stairs had been lowered, and later the crew felt a noticeable bump and change in pressure, the kind of thing you might feel if a heavy person stepped onto the stairs and then left the plane. It's hard to explain how quiet that ending is. There was no scream, no gunshot, no final radio message from him, just a man alone in the back of a plane, opening a door and stepping into black air. When the aircraft finally landed again, the crew moved quickly. They searched the cabin, and the scene looked almost normal. The seats were there, the cabin lights, the smell of smoke and stale drinks, and then the absence, the empty seat, the missing man, and the knowledge that he had walked out into weather that should have killed him. What he left behind became its own set of clues, a black clip-on tie, cigarette butts, a note, and fragments of description from the people who interacted with him: average height, calm voice, mid to late adulthood, dark suit, sunglasses, the kind of look that could blend into any airport crowd. And that's the nightmare of it, because even though this was a hijacking, it wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, which means the person doing it likely had a plan before he ever bought that ticket. Authorities launched a massive search almost immediately, because if he survived the jump, he had to land somewhere, and if he didn't survive, something should have been found: a parachute tangled in trees, a body, a bundle of cash, anything that marks an ending. But the terrain he dropped into was the kind that keeps secrets: thick forest, rivers, ravines, winter cold, and long stretches with few people. And the weather that night didn't help. It hid sound, hid visibility, and turned the ground into a wet, absorbing surface. Search teams combed through areas where the jump was estimated to have occurred: helicopters, ground crews, organized patterns. But it's one thing to search a field and another to search thousands of acres of forest where a person could be hidden by a single slope. And there was another problem: even if they found a parachute, even if they found scraps of fabric, the environment would destroy and scatter evidence fast. Water carries things away, mud swallows metal, trees hold cloth like traps, and in the early days the case became a race against nature. At the same time, investigators worked the other side of the mystery, the identity, because Dan Cooper was almost certainly not his real name, and the only real path to him was what he touched, what he said, and what he left behind. They collected descriptions from the flight attendants and crew, they built composites, and those sketches became the public face of a man no one could name, which is why the story took off, because the world loves a mystery with a face. Then the name itself shifted into myth, because the hijacker used Dan Cooper, but through confusion and repetition, the public began calling him D.B. Cooper, two letters that stuck so hard they became the entire legend. The case became famous for the balance of it: a crime committed without bloodshed, carried out with calm precision, and ending with a jump that felt impossible, because parachuting into a stormy night in business shoes doesn't sound survivable. That's why the theories split early. One side believed he was trained, military, experienced, someone who knew parachutes and aircraft and escape, and the other side believed the opposite, that he didn't understand the conditions, that the jump was suicidal, that he died in the woods and was simply never recovered. And then the story gained its most haunting physical detail years later, because a small portion of the ransom money turned up along the Columbia River, degraded bills, just enough to prove that at least some of the cash ended up on the ground, but not enough to prove who put it there or why. That discovery didn't close the case, it made it worse, because it suggested the money had traveled through the world somehow, through water or time or human hands, and yet the man it belonged to still didn't exist in any confirmed way. Over the years, suspects came and went like tides: men with military histories, men with aviation backgrounds, men with parachute experience, men who told stories late in life that sounded just believable enough to keep people listening. Every suspect brought the same problem. The case didn't need a man who could hijack a plane. It needed a man who could hijack a plane and then disappear without leaving a single undeniable trace. And that is a higher bar than most people realize. Because even if he survived, he had to land, and after landing he had to escape the woods, avoid injury, avoid hypothermia, hide a large amount of cash, and re-enter society without anyone noticing the blood, the bruises, the torn clothing, or the fact that a stranger just walked out of a storm with a parachute. And yet, the longer the case remained unresolved, the more possible it began to feel, because the world is full of people you don't notice, men who work quietly, move quietly, and live in the spaces where no one asks too many questions. That's the shape of the mystery. It's not just, who was he? It's, what kind of person can do something like this and then vanish back into normal life? Investigators kept returning to the same physical realities, the flight conditions, the weather, the terrain, and the money, because those are the few pieces that don't change with time. Everything else becomes rumor. And the truth is, both endings remain possible. He could have died within minutes of landing, swallowed by cold and forest and never been found, or he could have survived long enough to get out, and if he did, he likely never spoke about it again, because speaking is how you get caught. Either way, the story ends the same way, with a plane on the ground, a cabin empty, and a set of questions that refuse to stay in the past. A man boarded a short flight like it was nothing. He took control without firing a shot. He got paid. And then he stepped out of the sky. And more than anything else, that's why this case still holds people, because it ends with the most unsettling kind of absence. Not a chase, not a capture, not a body, just an empty seat where a person used to be, and the quiet certainty that whatever happened after that jump, the night kept it. After the plane landed, investigators treated the cabin like a crime scene. They photographed every seat, every surface, every place he might have touched, because they understood something rare had happened. A hijacker had vanished without leaving a clear exit trail. They collected what he left behind, a black clip-on tie, cigarette butts, and the handwritten note. And even though those items looked ordinary, they were the only physical connection to a man who might never be identified. The tie became one of the most important pieces because it was something he wore close to his body. It could carry fibers, dust, and microscopic traces from wherever he came from, and it also suggested something about him. He cared enough to look professional. But the same tie also raised a quiet question: why leave it? If you're about to bet your life on disappearing, you don't usually drop a personal item by accident unless you're so calm you don't even notice, or you're so confident you don't care. Investigators also took the flight crew's description seriously because Cooper had spoken to them up close, and the details were consistent: calm voice, controlled manner, polite, and unnervingly steady, like he had rehearsed being ordinary. Then they started building the hunt the way you build any hunt. You break it into two problems. The first problem is where he landed. The second problem is who he was, and both problems were worse than they looked at first. The landing zone was estimated based on flight speed, time, wind, and the moment the crew felt the change in the aircraft, but all of those inputs were imperfect because the weather was messy, the night was dark, and the plane was flying a route designed to be practical, not designed to be easy to calculate later. And even if you narrow the area, you're still talking about forests, rivers, and rough terrain, and searching forest is not like searching a street. You can stand 10 feet away from something and never see it because the land eats evidence. Teams searched anyway, ground crews, aircraft, organized patterns, but nothing surfaced. No parachute in the trees, no bundle of cash snagged on branches, no tracks leading out to a road, and the longer the search stayed empty, the more the story split into two realities. In one reality, Cooper survived, he landed, he escaped, and he disappeared into a normal life so smoothly that nobody ever recognized him. And in the other reality, Cooper died quickly, he hit the ground wrong, he broke something, he froze, and the wilderness simply kept him. Both realities felt possible because the jump itself sat on the edge between skill and suicide. It was night, it was cold, it was rainy, and he wasn't wearing gear that screamed paratrooper, but at the same time, His demands and his flight instructions didn't sound like a man guessing. He asked for parachutes, not one, but multiple, and that detail mattered because it suggested he understood how people respond. If he asked for only one parachute, they might sabotage it. But if he asked for more than one, they had to assume he could force someone else to use one too. He also insisted on a specific aircraft configuration, and whether he learned it through training or obsession, the result was the same. He created conditions where the rear stairs could be lowered and where the plane would stay stable enough for him to move in the back without instantly losing control. That rear staircase became the centerpiece of the legend because it turned the Boeing 727 into something like a magic trick, a passenger plane with a built-in escape hatch, and Cooper used it the way it was never meant to be used. Investigators studied the jump conditions like a math problem because if he survived, the physics would show it somewhere: wind drift, flight path, estimated timing, and if he didn't survive, the physics would still show it, because something should have been found. But then time did what it always does. It degraded clarity, it turned evidence into possibility, and it opened the door for the myth to grow faster than the facts. The name itself became part of that myth because the hijacker called himself Dan Cooper, but through reporting errors and repetition, the public latched on to D.B. Cooper, and once those initials took hold, it stopped being a man. It became a character. After that, America did what America always does with an unsolved mystery. It turned it into a mirror. People saw what they wanted to see: a genius outlaw, a doomed fool, a skilled jumper, a desperate man, a folk hero, a criminal, a ghost. Suspects started pouring in, and the problem with suspects is that you can always find someone who could have done it. You can always find a man with a military background, or parachute experience, or bitterness, or a story, but could is not the same as did. The FBI and investigators had to keep pulling the story back down to earth. They looked for things that don't lie: serial numbers on bills, physical traces, confirmed timelines, and any confession that came with proof only the real Cooper would know. And that ransom money, the bills themselves, became a silent tracking system because every bill had recorded serial numbers, meaning if Cooper survived and tried to spend the money, someone might spot it and connect it back to the hijacking. So for years, banks and businesses watched for it, and people checked their change like they were holding a lottery ticket, because any bill could have been the one that proved he lived. But the money didn't appear in stores, it didn't show up in a wave of suspicious spending, it didn't create the trail investigators hoped for, and that absence pushed the story toward the darker possibility that he never had the chance to spend it. Then, in 1980, the case took one of its strangest turns because a child found some of the ransom money buried along the Columbia River. Not all of it, just a portion, degraded and bundled like it had been waiting there for years. That discovery didn't solve anything. It widened the mystery because it proved the money reached the ground, but it didn't prove Cooper survived, and it didn't prove Cooper died. It just proved that at least part of the cash entered the world below the aircraft. People argued about how it got there. Some believed Cooper buried it and never returned. Some believed flooding carried it. Some believed it was planted. And the truth is, the money find can support multiple stories depending on what you assume first. If you assume Cooper survived, the money could be a stash, a mistake, or a fragment lost during escape. And if you assume Cooper died, the money could be debris moved by water or a bundle that broke free from wherever he landed. But no matter what theory you choose, the money creates one uncomfortable fact: the crime left the sky and touched the earth, and still the man remained missing. Over time, the physical evidence aged into something almost symbolic: the tie clip, the note, the money, and the handful of descriptions, and investigators had to accept that the case might never be solved the way people imagine solved, with handcuffs and a confession. And yet, every few years the mystery would surge back to life: a new suspect, a new claim, a new documentary, a new theory, and each time the same question returned. If Cooper survived, how did he get away so clean? Because escaping the jump is only the first step. The second step is escaping the ground. He would have landed in cold, wet conditions, possibly injured, possibly disoriented, carrying a heavy bundle of cash, wearing clothes that would stand out if he walked into a diner at midnight. So for him to survive and disappear, he would likely need one of two things, either a level of skill and luck that borders on impossible, or help, someone waiting, someone with a vehicle, someone who knew where to look. But help creates its own problems, because help means a second person, and second people talk, second people brag, second people get caught, second people leave trails, and for decades, no confirmed helper ever surfaced. That pushes many people back toward the simplest, brutal ending, that Cooper died out there, and the wilderness did what wilderness does. It erased him, and the only reason the story feels like he might have lived is because nothing was found. And that's the strange psychology of the case. The lack of evidence creates hope for survival, but the lack of spending creates doubt, and the case lives in the space between those two silences. Investigators kept revisiting the tie and the other items as forensic science improved, because sometimes old evidence becomes new evidence when technology catches up. And in a case like this, a microscopic detail could be more valuable than 1,000 theories. But even with better forensics, the case faced a problem that can't be solved by technology alone. Too much time had passed, too many leads had turned to dust, and the suspect list had become crowded with men who looked good on paper, but didn't come with proof. Eventually, the official investigation slowed, not because the mystery stopped being interesting, but because resources are finite, and the case had turned into a loop. New tips, old suspects, no closure. And that's where the story ends up today, suspended between two endings that both feel possible. A man dies in the trees and becomes part of the land, or a man survives and becomes part of the crowd. But either way, the central fact remains untouched. He took control of a commercial flight without firing a shot. He got exactly what he demanded, and then he opened a door in the back of the plane and stepped into weather that should have killed him. The most unsettling part isn't that he jumped, it's that the jump worked in the only way that mattered. It broke the story, it split the timeline into before and after, and everything after is just empty space where an answer should be. Because the moment he left that aircraft, he stopped being a suspect you can interview, he stopped being a man you can chase, he became a question falling through darkness. And that's why this case never really gets old, not because of the money, not because of the suspects, but because of the quiet simplicity of the ending. A short flight, a calm voice, a rear staircase, and then an empty seat. After the jump, the case split into two hunts, the hunt for a landing zone and the hunt for a name, and the second hunt was always harder, because the man Cooper presented to the crew was almost designed to be forgettable. He didn't have a distinctive accent, he didn't have a dramatic scar, he didn't rant or threaten, he spoke politely, he kept his sunglasses on, and he wore the kind of outfit that turns you into background noise in an airport. So investigators built the identity hunt around what he touched, what he left, and what he seemed to know, because those are the only things that can outlast a disguise. The first big question was whether he was trained, because his demands about the Boeing 727 were too specific to ignore. He wanted a low-altitude flight, slower speed, gear down, and the kind of stable configuration that makes the rear air stair usable. That doesn't automatically mean he was a pilot, but it suggests familiarity. Either he had been around aircraft, read technical material, worked in aviation, or knew someone who did. The parachutes became another test of his knowledge, because he didn't just demand one, he demanded multiple, which hinted he understood sabotage risk. If authorities believed only one parachute was needed, they might tamper with it. But the type of parachutes he accepted created debate, because some accounts suggest one of the reserve chutes provided was not a true functional reserve. It was a training or demonstration shoot, and if that's accurate, it suggests either he didn't notice or he didn't care, which points away from a meticulous expert. So right away, even his skill level splits. One side sees a professional, the other side sees a confident amateur who knew just enough to sound in control. Then investigators looked at his behavior, because behavior is a fingerprint too. He was calm, he released the passengers, he avoided unnecessary violence, and he kept the crew alive. That combination suggests he wanted the cleanest escape possible. A man planning to disappear doesn't want a murder case attached to him. Murders bring heat, resources, urgency, and mistakes. Cooper's plan looked like he wanted a crime that ended the moment he left the aircraft. From there, the suspect world exploded because once a case becomes famous, it starts attracting suspects the way a light attracts insects. Tips flood in. Ex-wives call, neighbors call, people report a co-worker who always seemed like the type. And the FBI had to filter all of it through a small number of hard criteria. Did the person match the physical description? Did they have access to parachute knowledge? Were they in the right region? Could they disappear afterward without anyone noticing? One of the earliest and most persistent suspect types was the military man, because in the 1960s and 70s, military training produced a lot of people comfortable with aircraft, parachutes, and risk. But that category was also uselessly large because it described thousands of men, and most of them were not hijackers. Most of them were simply veterans with normal lives. So investigators began focusing on something else, motive and timing. The hijacking happened right before Thanksgiving, which meant airport crowds, heavy travel, and a busy system. It also meant a long weekend afterward, which could help someone vanish. A man planning this might choose that date because it creates noise, and noise hides movement. Then came the copycat problem because less than a year later, another hijacker attempted a similar crime, and that person, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., became one of the first major could-it-be-him suspects. McCoy's case looked similar on the surface. He hijacked a plane, demanded money, used a parachute, and jumped. But investigators argued the differences were huge. The mannerisms, the speech, the behavior, and the timing didn't line up cleanly. McCoy also got caught, and that fact alone makes many people believe he was not the same man, because Cooper's greatest skill, if you want to call it that, was disappearing, and McCoy failed at that. Still, McCoy's existence affected everything because it proved the method was possible. It proved a man could jump from a passenger aircraft and survive, and it also proved that once the Cooper story hit the news, people would imitate it. And imitation contaminates mystery cases because it becomes harder to tell what details belong to the original and what details belong to a culture copying it. As years went on, the suspect list became less about who could do it and more about who left a shadow that fits. Men with strange confessions, men with suspicious injuries after Thanksgiving 1971, men who suddenly had cash, men who made comments that sounded like knowledge. A common suspect pattern was this: someone in the Pacific Northwest with military or aviation background who had reasons to need money and who later hinted about it to a spouse or friend. But confessions without proof are cheap, and investigators needed proof that only Cooper could provide, something like a detail about the money packaging, the parachute selection, the exact sequence on the plane, something not publicly known at the time. That is why so many popular suspects rise and fall. Their biographies sound perfect, but the case doesn't move because biography is not evidence. Some suspects were former airline employees because they would know aircraft layouts, procedures, and the quirks of a Boeing 727. That idea makes intuitive sense, but it also raises a contradiction. An airline employee would likely understand how brutal that jump was, the weather, the darkness, the risks of landing injured in forest, and that knowledge might actually make them less likely to attempt it, unless they believe the jump wasn't as bad as people think, or they had a plan on the ground, or they expected to land near help. And that circles back to the biggest hidden question in the entire case. Did he have help? If Cooper had a pre-planned pickup, a driver, a location, a meeting point, then the survival odds improve dramatically, because the most dangerous part isn't the jump, it's what happens after you land cold, wet, and injured. But help also creates risk, because help means another person who can slip, another person who can brag, another person who can be pressured, and over decades, no helper has been confirmed. That doesn't prove he had no help, it only proves that if help existed, it was silent, and silence is rare. The ransom money discovery years later deepened that debate, because finding a small portion of the cash on a riverbank suggests movement, water movement, human movement, or both. If water carried it, then maybe the money entered the river system, which might imply he landed near water or his belongings did. If humans placed it, then it could be a stash, a loss, or a deliberate discard. But none of those options confirm survival. They only confirm that the money's story continued after the jump. This is why the Cooper case never settles. The physical evidence supports multiple endings, and each ending has a but attached. He survived, but where did he spend the money? He died, but why was so little found? He had help, but why did no one talk? He had no help, but how did he get out? Even Cooper's clothing became part of the argument, because a suit and loafers sound like death in the woods, but some people believe that was the point. A suit makes you look harmless. It gets you onto the plane without attention. And if you plan to change clothes after landing, the suit is just a costume for the first act. That brings up another quiet detail. He carried a briefcase which could have held more than a bomb. It could have held gloves, a cap, a basic survival item, even a change of clothes, and no one ever got to inventory it because he took it into the night. So the case becomes a story about missing containers, the briefcase that vanished, the parachute that vanished, the body that vanished, and the only thing that didn't vanish was the myth. Over time, investigators revisited old evidence as science improved, because sometimes the smallest trace becomes the loudest, a fiber, a particle, a residue on a tie, and while those techniques can narrow possibilities, they still need a match, a known person, to compare against. And that is the curse of a mystery like this. You can have better tools, but if the suspect pool is the entire world, better tools only sharpen the same question. So today, if you go deeper into Cooper, you end up in the same place investigators ended up, not a single perfect suspect, but a set of competing realities. A skilled man who took a calculated risk and vanished. A confident amateur who misjudged the jump and died unseen. A man with help who escaped cleanly. A man without help who got lucky beyond reason. And the reason the story still works, the reason it still pulls people in, is because none of those endings can be proven enough to kill the others. The case doesn't have a final image, it has an empty seat and an open door and a man who stepped into weather and became a question mark that never hit the ground. And that's where the D.B. Cooper case becomes less like a puzzle and more like a boundary, the line between what can be investigated and what can only be imagined. Because the truth is, every possible ending has a cost, and the case survives because no ending can be proven without paying that cost in evidence. If he survived, then he had to do something almost impossible after landing. He had to move through cold, wet forest in the dark, carrying a heavy bundle of cash, possibly injured, possibly lost, and still reach a road, a town, or a safe place without anyone noticing the mud, the bruises, the torn clothing, or the parachute gear. He would have had to get clean, get rid of evidence, and re-enter normal life fast. And the most dangerous part of that isn't the walking, it's the human contact, because surviving means meeting someone eventually, a driver, a clerk, a friend, and human contact creates stories, and stories create trails. Yet for decades there was no verified trail of spending, no flood of serial numbers turning up, no confirmed witness who could say they saw a man stumble out of the woods with cash and a parachute. So if he lived quietly, and if he spent the money, he did it in a way that never created a loud pattern, which is possible, but it requires discipline, patience, and a willingness to sit on a fortune rather than flash it. And that brings you to the darker version of he survived, the version where he survives the jump, but not the aftermath, where he lands, he moves, he tries, and somewhere along the way the cold or an injury catches up, and he becomes what the forest is full of, an unmarked ending hidden under leaves. If he died quickly, then the wilderness did what it often does. It erased him, it scattered cloth, swallowed metal, and buried bone. In that ending, the mystery exists not because it's supernatural, but because nature is bigger than search teams, bigger than certainty, and sometimes bigger than closure. But that ending has a problem too, because even if the wilderness kept his body, you would expect more of the money to surface over time. You would expect a parachute to snag and be discovered. You would expect something, a strap, a buckle, a bundle, a fragment. The fact that so little was found doesn't disprove death, it just keeps the door open. And then there is the help theory, because help explains the clean disappearance better than luck. Help means the moment he hit the ground, the danger dropped. Help means he didn't have to hike for miles. Help means he wasn't alone. But help also creates the biggest risk of all. Help creates another human being with knowledge, another person who could be pressured, another person who could slip, another person who could eventually talk. Yet no confirmed helper ever surfaced, not in a way that ended the case. No verified meeting point, no verified driver, no verified confession with details that only a helper would know. So the case keeps circling the same truth. Whatever happened after the jump, it happened in silence, and that silence is exactly what Cooper needed, because the most brilliant part of the crime wasn't the ransom demand, it wasn't the bomb threat, it wasn't even the jump. It was choosing an ending that does not generate witnesses. The moment Cooper stepped onto that rear staircase, he changed the investigation from a manhunt into a weather problem. He traded police for forests. He traded cameras for darkness. He traded fingerprints for rain. Once the door opened, the world could no longer watch him. It could only guess. That is why the case became a legend, not because he was a hero, not because he was clever, but because he achieved the one thing criminals almost never achieve. He removed the ending. Every other famous crime has a conclusion, an arrest, a corpse, a confession, or at least a confirmed scene. Cooper's crime ends with an absence so clean it feels unreal. A man buys a ticket with cash, sits down, speaks calmly, collects money, and then steps into the night. The plane lands again, and there is no him. Just an empty seat, just a clipped tie left behind, just questions. And decades later, the case remains frozen in that moment, because the world never got the last chapter. If you imagine the jump, the real jump, not the myth, you can feel how thin the margin was. Wind hitting his body like a wall. Darkness swallowing the aircraft lights above. Trees below like a moving black ocean. Water cutting through the landscape like veins. One wrong movement and it's over. One broken bone and it's over. One landing in the wrong place and it's over. So maybe the most honest truth of this case is that it doesn't need a glamorous ending. It can end quietly either way. Quiet survival, quiet death. And that quiet is exactly what makes it powerful. Because it means that somewhere in some version of history, D.B. Cooper either died in the cold and became part of the land, or he lived long enough to take off his suit, hide his money, and become just another man walking through an airport crowd. And if that's what happened, then the most unsettling possibility isn't that he survived, it's that he survived and nobody ever noticed, that he went back to work, that he sat at a dinner table, that he watched the news about himself, that he lived long enough to hear people argue about whether he was alive, and that he never once corrected them. Because the moment you correct the world, you become real again. And Cooper's greatest trick was making himself unreal. So the story ends the same way it began, with something ordinary, an airline seat, a short flight, a man in a suit. Then a note. Then a calm voice. Then an open door, and then nothing. And that's why, more than 50 years later, this case still doesn't land. There's one more reason this story refuses to die. And it's simple. The D.B. Cooper case doesn't just leave questions, it leaves space. Most crimes leave behind something heavy, a scene, a body, a confession, a long trail of mistakes. Even if the killer is never found, there's usually an ending you can point to and say, that is where it stopped. This one doesn't stop, it drops off. The moment he stepped onto that rear staircase, he turned himself into a moving target with no witness, no camera, no clear landing point, just wind, darkness, and miles of forest. And if you think about it, that's the real trick, not the hijacking, not the ransom, not even the jump. The trick is that he chose an ending that could never be fully verified. If he died, the wilderness could erase him. If he lived, the world could swallow him. Either way, the outcome looks the same from the cockpit, a light on the panel, a shift in the airframe, and then an empty cabin. That's why the small details people cling to become so important. The tie clip, the cigarettes, the money that surfaced years later, because those are the only pieces that prove this wasn't a rumor. But none of those pieces give you the one thing your brain wants most, the final image. So the case stays suspended over the Pacific Northwest like the plane itself, a short flight that never really ended because the man who started it never left an ending behind. Somewhere out there, the truth is simple. Either a man hit the ground hard and never got up, or a man landed, got to his feet, and walked away. And the reason we can't stop staring at this story is because both endings feel possible, and both endings feel frightening for different reasons. One says the world can swallow you without a trace, the other says someone can do something impossible, and then sit down in a crowd and become invisible again. So if you ever find yourself looking at old photos of airports and airline seats from the 1970s, or hearing that name whispered like a campfire story, remember what made this case legendary. It wasn't the money, it wasn't the bomb, it was the empty seat, because the only thing D.B. Cooper ever truly gave the world was proof that a person can step into the dark and leave behind nothing but a question.